The autumn wind rattled the windows of Margaret Thompson's modest two-story home in Elmhurst, Illinois, as she carefully arranged the family photos on her mantelpiece. At 68, her hands moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades caring for others, first as an elementary school teacher for 30 years, then as a devoted mother and wife. The golden light of October filtered through her lace curtains, casting warm shadows across the living room where she and Harold had shared so many memories. Harold, gone now for 2 years, but his presence still filled every corner of their home. Their 45th wedding anniversary would have been next Saturday. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret smoothed her cardigan and opened the door to find her son David standing on the porch, his expensive suit immaculate despite the Chicago wind. At 42, David had inherited his father's sharp features but none of his warmth. "Hello, David," Margaret smiled, stepping aside. "Come in, sweetheart. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." David remained in the doorway, his expression cold. "I can't stay long, Mom. I'm here about the anniversary celebration." Margaret's heart fluttered with hope. For weeks, she had wondered if the family would acknowledge what would have been her and Harold's 45th anniversary. She'd mentioned it to David and her daughter Sarah several times, hoping they might organize a small memorial gathering. "Oh, how wonderful. I was hoping—" "No, Mom." David's voice cut through her excitement like a blade. "You need to understand something. Sarah and I have decided to have a celebration." "Yes, but it's not for you to attend." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the doorframe for support, the autumn air suddenly feeling arctic against her face. I don't understand," she whispered. David's jaw tightened with barely concealed irritation. "Look, Mom, let's be honest here. Ever since Dad died, you've become difficult, needy, always calling, always wanting to be included in everything. The family needs space to grieve properly, and frankly, your constant presence is making it harder for everyone." Margaret's knees nearly buckled. This was her son, the boy she had rocked to sleep, helped with homework, cheered at every baseball game, the man she had supported through his divorce, the grandfather whose children she babysat every weekend. "David, I'm your mother. This is my anniversary too. Harold was my husband for 45 years. Was, Mom, was. He's gone. And holding on to the past isn't healthy for anyone." David checked his expensive watch with obvious impatience. "The celebration is at the Heritage Country Club this Saturday at 6. We've invited Dad's colleagues, his golf buddies, extended family, old friends. People want to remember him without having to manage your emotions too." The cruelty of his words settled over Margaret like a suffocating blanket. She had taught hundreds of children to be kind, to include others, to honor their parents. Now her own son was treating her like an unwanted burden. Who did you invite?" she managed to ask, her voice barely audible. David shrugged. "Everyone who mattered to Dad. His poker group, the guys from the hardware store where he worked before retiring, his army buddies, neighbors, church friends, cousins, about 45 people total. People who can celebrate his life properly." 45 people, Margaret repeated numbly. "Yes, and before you ask, no, you're not invited. Sarah agrees with me completely. This is what's best for everyone." David turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mom, please don't try to show up anyway. It would be embarrassing for everyone involved." The door closed with a finality that echoed through Margaret's heart. She stood in her empty living room, surrounded by 45 years of memories, feeling more alone than she had since Harold's funeral. But as the initial shock wore off, something else began to grow in Margaret's chest. Not anger, exactly, but a quiet determination. Harold had always said she was stronger than she knew. Maybe it was time to prove him right. Margaret walked to her desk and pulled out her address book, the old-fashioned kind with actual pages and handwritten entries. She had kept meticulous records over the years. Every family friend, every colleague, every neighbor who had touched their lives. Her finger traced down the pages, counting. 45 people, David had said. 45 people who mattered to Harold. Margaret smiled for the first time since her son's visit. She had an idea that would either heal her family or confirm once and for all where she truly stood in their lives. Either way, she would face Saturday night knowing she had honored her husband's memory in the way he deserved. The autumn wind continued to blow outside, but inside Margaret Thompson's house, the storm was just beginning. Chapter 2. The phone calls begin. Margaret spent the rest of Tuesday evening sitting at her kitchen table, Harold's old reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied her address book under the warm glow of the overhead light. The house felt different now, not empty, but charged with purpose. She had divided her contacts into categories. Harold's army unit from Vietnam, his co-workers from Thompson's Hardware. The store had been in his family for 3 generations before they sold it. His golf foursome, their church congregation, neighbors from their 40 years on Maple Street, and family scattered across the Midwest. Wednesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather for the Chicago suburbs. Margaret made her coffee extra strong and settled at the kitchen phone, the same yellow rotary phone Harold had insisted on keeping despite David's mockery about joining the modern world. Her first call was to Frank Martinez, Harold's closest friend from the army. They had served together in Da Nang and had maintained their friendship for over 5 decades. "Frank, it's Margaret Thompson. Maggie, how are you holding up, sweetheart?" Frank's gravelly voice carried genuine warmth. "I was just thinking about you and Harold yesterday." Margaret's resolve wavered slightly at his kindness. "Frank, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Did David call you about an anniversary celebration this Saturday?" A pause. "Yes, he did. At the Heritage Country Club. I was planning to attend." "Margaret, are you all right? You sound upset. Did he mention that I wouldn't be there?" Another pause. Longer this time. He said you were having a difficult time with grief and had decided not to come. I thought it was strange, but people grieve differently." Margaret closed her eyes. Even in his cruelty, David had found a way to make her the problem. "Frank, that's not true. David uninvited me. He told me I wasn't wanted there." The silence stretched so long, Margaret wondered if the connection had been lost. Then Frank's voice returned, tight with anger. "That son of a—" "Excuse me, Maggie. That's not right. Not right at all. Harold would be furious if he knew." "I have a favor to ask," Margaret said quietly. "I want you to still go to the party, but I also want to invite you to something else. Would you come to dinner at my house Saturday at 5, before David's celebration?" "Of course I will. What do you need me to do?" Margaret explained her plan, and with each word, she felt Harold's presence more strongly. This was what he would have done, faced adversity with grace and quiet strength. The second call was to Harold's golf partner Bill Chen, a retired accountant whose dry humor had kept Harold laughing for 20 years. Bill's reaction was swift and decisive. "Margaret, this is unconscionable. I'm not just coming to dinner. I'm bringing Linda, and we're both skipping that country club nonsense entirely. A man's wife of 45 years not invited to his memorial? Over my dead body." By noon, Margaret had made 15 calls. The reactions ranged from shock to outrage to immediate offers of support. Harold's poker buddies from the VFW hall were particularly vocal in their disgust. "Mrs. Thompson," said Jerry Walsh, Harold's Thursday night poker rival, "my Mary would haunt me from beyond if I let this stand. Count us in for Saturday dinner, and count us out of anything your son organized." The most difficult call was to her sister-in-law, Harold's younger sister Patricia, who lived in Milwaukee. Patricia had always been close to David, and Margaret braced for potential rejection. "Patricia, it's Margaret. I need to tell you something about Saturday's celebration." "Oh, honey, I'm so looking forward to seeing everyone. It'll be just like the old days when Harold would hold court with his stories." Margaret's heart sank as she explained the situation. Patricia's shocked silence stretched painfully long. "Margaret Elizabeth Thompson," Patricia finally said, using Margaret's full name the way Harold used to when he was serious. "Are you telling me that my nephew uninvited my brother's wife from his own anniversary memorial?" "I'm afraid so." "Well, that settles it. I'm driving down from Milwaukee, and I'm bringing the whole family. We'll be at your house at 5 sharp, and David can explain to his children why Grandma Pat isn't at his fancy party." By Thursday evening, Margaret had reached 37 of the 45 people David had invited. The responses had been overwhelmingly supportive, with most choosing to attend her dinner instead of the country club celebration. A few, mostly Harold's distant cousins, said they would try to attend both, diplomatically avoiding taking sides. The 3 people she couldn't reach were on vacation, or had disconnected phone numbers. But 34 confirmations for Saturday dinner was more than her small house could accommodate. Margaret sat in Harold's old recliner, surveying her living and dining rooms with a mixture of excitement and panic. That's when her neighbor, Mrs. Chen from next door, no relation to Harold's golf partner Bill, knocked on her door with a covered dish. "Margaret, dear, I couldn't help but notice all the activity. Are you having a party?" Margaret explained the situation to her neighbor, who had lived next door for 15 years and had considered Harold and Margaret like family. Mrs. Chen's expression grew increasingly indignant as the story unfolded. "This is terrible. But Margaret, I have an idea. What if we use our backyard too? My husband can set up tables between our yards, and I have folding chairs in the garage. We'll make it a proper neighborhood celebration of Harold's life." By Friday morning, the simple dinner had transformed into something Margaret never could have imagined. Mrs. Chen had enlisted 3 other neighbor families. The Kowalskis offered their grill for hamburgers and hot dogs. The Washingtons volunteered to coordinate side dishes. The young couple at the end of the block, the Patels, insisted on providing dessert from their family's bakery. As Margaret sat in her kitchen Friday evening, addressing handwritten thank you notes to everyone who had offered to help, she felt Harold's presence more strongly than she had since his death. This was what their life had been about: community, kindness, inclusion, not the cold exclusion David had tried to impose. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret glanced at the caller ID and saw David's number. For a moment, she considered not answering. Then she picked up the receiver. "Hello, David. Mom, I need to ask you something." His voice carried a strange tension. "Have you been calling people about Saturday?" Margaret straightened in her chair. "Yes, I have. Why are people calling me to cancel? Frank Martinez just told me he couldn't make it to the country club because of a prior commitment." "What prior commitment?" "Dinner with me," Margaret said simply. The silence that followed was charged with David's barely controlled fury. "Mom, what have you done? I've invited my friends to remember Harold with me, the same friends you invited to remember him without me. You can't just— This is sabotage. You're ruining Dad's memorial." For the first time in 2 years, Margaret felt truly calm. "No, David, I'm honoring it, the way Harold would have wanted." She gently hung up the phone and returned to her thank you notes. Outside her window, she could see the Chens setting up the first of the borrowed tables in the yard. Tomorrow would be a day of reckoning, but tonight, Margaret Thompson felt more herself than she had since Harold's death. Chapter 3. The gathering Saturday dawned crisp and clear, with that perfect autumn light that turned suburban Chicago into a Norman Rockwell painting. Margaret woke before her alarm, feeling a mixture of nervous excitement and profound sadness. Today would have been her 45th wedding anniversary. She began her morning as she had every day since Harold's death, with coffee at their kitchen table and a one-sided conversation with his empty chair. "Well, Harold, today's the day. I hope you approve of what I've planned. I think you would have handled this differently. Probably would have sat David down and given him one of your famous life lessons talks. But this is my way of fighting back with kindness." By 3 p.m., Margaret's backyard had been transformed. The Chens, Kowalskis, Washingtons, and Patels had worked since noon setting up a network of tables across 3 adjoining yards. Strings of lights hung between the maple trees, and borrowed heaters were positioned strategically around the seating areas. The setup could easily accommodate 50 people. Margaret had spent the morning cooking Harold's favorite dishes, her famous pot roast, green bean casserole, and the cornbread recipe his mother had taught her when they were newlyweds. The neighbors had coordinated a potluck feast that would have made Harold beam with pride. At 4:30, Margaret changed into the navy blue dress Harold had always said brought out her eyes. She pinned on the small pearl brooch he had given her for their 25th anniversary and took a deep breath. The first guests arrived precisely at 5 p.m., Frank Martinez and his wife Rosa, bearing a beautiful arrangement of yellow roses, Harold's favorite flowers. "Maggie, you look beautiful," Frank said, embracing her warmly. Harold would be so proud. Within 30 minutes, Margaret's backyard was filled with voices, laughter, and the clinking of silverware. Bill and Linda Chen, Harold's golf partners, had driven in from Schaumburg. The poker group from the VFW arrived en masse, bringing their wives and a collection of Harold's favorite beer. Patricia drove down from Milwaukee with her 3 adult children and their families, including Harold's great-nieces and nephews, who had adored their Uncle Harry. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the gathered crowd, Margaret stood on her back porch and looked out at the celebration. 41 people had come, everyone she had called except for those few who couldn't be reached or were out of town. But more than that, word had spread through the neighborhood and Harold's various communities. Former students of Margaret's had shown up. Harold's barber, the mailman who had delivered to their house for 20 years, even the pharmacist from the corner drugstore where Harold had picked up his medications. Margaret counted heads and realized there were nearly 60 people in her backyard, sharing stories and celebrating a life well lived. Jerry Walsh from the poker group stood up and tapped his beer bottle with a fork. The crowd gradually quieted. "Folks, I'd like to say something about Harold Thompson and his beautiful wife Margaret. Jerry's voice carried across the yard. Harold was the kind of man who never met a stranger. He'd give you the shirt off his back and then ask if you needed help putting it on. Laughter rippled through the crowd. But more than that, Harold loved his family fiercely. He talked about Maggie at every poker game. 45 years of marriage, and he still lit up like a teenager when he talked about her. He was proud of his kids, sure, but Margaret was his heart. Margaret felt tears starting, but they were good tears. Healing tears. Now, I don't know what kind of foolishness led to Margaret being excluded from some fancy party tonight, but I know this. Harold would have wanted to be exactly where we are right now, with his wife, surrounded by people who truly knew him and loved him. The crowd erupted in applause and raised glasses. Margaret felt Harold's presence so strongly, she almost turned around to look for him. As the evening progressed, people shared stories. Frank Martinez talked about Harold's courage in Vietnam and his unwavering loyalty to his friends. Bill Chen described Harold's terrible golf swing, but his excellent sportsmanship. Patricia shared childhood memories of her big brother's protective nature and his love of practical jokes. At 7:30, as the celebration was reaching its peak, Margaret noticed a car pull up in front of her house. Through the living room window, she could see David getting out of his BMW, followed by Sarah and her husband Mike. They walked slowly toward the backyard, their faces masks of confusion and something that might have been shame. The crowd noticed them too, and conversations began to die down. Margaret felt every eye turned toward her as her children approached the gathering. David looked around at the assembled crowd, his expensive suit now seeming ridiculously formal compared to the casual warmth of the backyard celebration. His face was pale, and for the first time in years, he looked uncertain. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the evening breeze. We were at the country club and..." He swallowed hard. There were 12 people there. 12 out of 45. Sarah stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I'm so sorry. We were wrong, so terribly wrong." Margaret looked at her children, really looked at them, and saw not the cold, dismissive adults who had excluded her, but the hurt, confused people they had become in their grief. Grief, she realized, that they had never properly processed. The country club called at 7 to ask if they should start serving dinner or wait for more guests. David continued, his voice breaking. "The manager said it was the smallest memorial service he'd ever hosted. That's when I realized what we'd done, what I'd done." Margaret walked down from the porch, through the crowd of Harold's friends and family, until she stood directly in front of her son. The backyard fell completely silent. "David," she said gently, "are you here because the party failed, or because you understand why it failed?" David's composure cracked completely. "Because I understand, Mom. Because I've been an ass, and I've dishonored Dad's memory, and I've hurt you in ways I never should have." Tears ran down his face. "I've been so angry since he died. Angry at him for leaving. Angry at you for reminding me he was gone. Angry at myself for not being the man he was. But taking that out on you... Mom, I'm so sorry." Sarah wrapped her arms around her mother. "We both are. We've been terrible children, and Dad would be ashamed of us." Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, faces of people who had chosen love over pride, inclusion over exclusion, community over coldness. Then she looked back at her children, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since Harold's death. "He wouldn't be ashamed," she said quietly. "He'd be sad that you were hurting so badly you couldn't see past your own pain, but he'd also be proud of you for coming here tonight, for acknowledging your mistake, for choosing to be better." She reached out and took both of her children's hands. "There are 2 chairs at the head table with your names on them. Your father saved them for you, just in case." As David and Sarah joined the celebration, something shifted in the autumn air. The evening continued with renewed warmth, but now it included the whole family, broken and healing, but together. At 9 p.m., as the last guests were preparing to leave, Patricia approached Margaret with a knowing smile. "You know, Margaret, this is exactly what Harold would have wanted. All his favorite people. Good food, stories, and laughter. But most of all, his family learning to love each other again." Margaret hugged her sister-in-law tightly. "I hope so. I really hope so." As the cleanup began, Margaret noticed David and Sarah working alongside the neighbors, stacking chairs and clearing tables. For the first time in 2 years, they looked like Harold's children again. Chapter 4. The Resolution. 3 weeks later, Margaret was in her kitchen preparing Sunday dinner when the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find David standing on her porch, but this time his expression was warm and slightly nervous. "Hi, Mom. I was wondering..." Could we talk? Margaret stepped aside, noting that David looked different somehow. Less rigid, more like the son she remembered from before Harold's death. Of course, sweetheart. Would you like some coffee? Actually, David said, pulling out a bottle of Harold's favorite whiskey. I thought we might share this instead. Dad always said the important conversations required something stronger than coffee. They settled in the living room, in the same chairs where Harold used to read his evening paper, and Margaret would grade her students' homework. David poured 2 small glasses of whiskey and handed one to his mother. Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night 3 weeks ago. About Dad, about you, about the kind of man I want to be. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. I've been seeing a therapist. Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. David had always been skeptical of emotional stuff, as he called it. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Frank's daughter-in-law, actually. Frank recommended her after the anniversary dinner. She specializes in grief counseling. How do you feel about that? Margaret asked gently. David laughed, but it was a real laugh, not the bitter sound that had characterized his laughter for the past 2 years. Terrified, relieved, angry at myself for waiting so long. He met his mother's eyes. Mom, I haven't properly grieved Dad's death. Instead, I've been running from it, and in the process, I've been running from everyone who reminded me of him, especially you. Margaret felt tears starting. Oh, David. No, let me finish. I need to say this. David set down his glass and leaned forward. You look like him, you know. You have his eyes, his smile when you're truly happy. You smell like the house I grew up in, like the home Dad loved. Every time I saw you after his funeral, it was like the universe was reminding me that he was gone, and I was scared I couldn't fill his shoes. Sweetheart, you were never supposed to replace him. You were supposed to be you. I know that now. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I was carrying this impossible burden, trying to be the man of the family without understanding what that actually meant. Dad wasn't the man of our family because he was controlling or dismissive. He was the man of our family because he was loving and inclusive and protective of everyone he cared about. David picked up his glass again and took a small sip. When I saw all those people in your backyard that night, people who came because they loved you and Dad, people who drove hours just to support you, I realized what I'd actually done. I hadn't protected the family. I'd tried to destroy it. Margaret reached over and took her son's hand. But you came back. That's what matters. Sarah's been going to counseling too. Different therapist, but same process. We've both been carrying so much guilt and anger, and we took it out on the person who least deserved it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the afternoon sun streaming through the lace curtains and casting familiar patterns on the carpet. Mom, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. All right, do you think Dad would be proud of who I am now? Not who I was 3 weeks ago, but who I'm trying to become. Margaret studied her son's face, really studied it, and saw Harold's stubborn determination, but also Harold's capacity for growth and change. I think your father would be proud that you recognized your mistakes and chose to fix them. He always said that being a good man isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up and doing better. David nodded, blinking back tears. There's something else. Sarah and I want to establish something in Dad's memory. Not a party or a plaque, but something ongoing. What did you have in mind? A scholarship fund at the community college for students who want to learn trades, carpentry, plumbing, electrical work. Dad always believed in the dignity of working with your hands, and he helped so many young people over the years at the hardware store. Margaret's heart swelled. This was exactly the kind of legacy Harold would have wanted. But there's a condition, David continued. We want you to be in charge of it. You're better with people than we are, and you understand Dad's values better than anyone. Will you do it? Oh, David, of course I will. That evening, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself having her nightly conversation with Harold's empty chair, but tonight felt different. Well, Harold, I think we did it. I think we brought our family back together. It wasn't the way either of us would have planned, but maybe that's how the best healing happens, when you least expect it, and in ways you never imagined. She paused, looking at the family photo on the mantelpiece. Herself, Harold, David, and Sarah, from happier times. David looks more like you every day, you know. Not just physically, but in his heart. And Sarah called this afternoon to ask if she could bring the grandchildren over next weekend. They want to plant a garden in the backyard where the party was. Flowers that will bloom every spring to remember you. Margaret turned off the lights and headed upstairs, but at the bottom of the staircase, she paused. I miss you, Harold Thompson. I miss you every single day, but I'm not afraid anymore. I know now that our love didn't die with you. It just changed shape. It's in David's willingness to change, in Sarah's tears of apology, in Frank's loyalty, in all those people who showed up that night because they loved us both. As she climbed the stairs, Margaret could have sworn she heard Harold's voice on the autumn wind outside. "Well done, Maggie. Well done." The next morning, Margaret woke to find a small envelope slipped under her front door. Inside was a handwritten note from David. "Mom, thank you for showing me what Dad's love actually looked like. Thank you for fighting for our family with grace instead of anger. Thank you for being the woman Dad always said you were, stronger than you know, kinder than you realize, and more important to all of us than we ever properly told you. Sarah and I would like to take you to dinner next Sunday. Somewhere nice, but not too fancy. You know how Dad felt about pretentious restaurants. We want to start a new tradition, monthly family dinners where we actually talk to each other like people who love each other. Would 5 p.m. work for you? All my love, your son, David P.S." The scholarship fund received its first donation yesterday. $10,000 from Frank Martinez and the VFW Poker Group. They said Harold would have wanted to get things started properly. Margaret smiled, folded the note carefully, and placed it in Harold's old desk drawer, the one where she kept all the important papers and precious memories. Outside her window, Mrs. Chen was hanging laundry in the backyard, where 41 people had gathered 3 weeks ago to celebrate love, memory, and the radical power of inclusion. Margaret Thompson had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting back with anger, but from responding to cruelty with such overwhelming kindness that it transforms everyone it touches.